Okay, so our next region is Southeast Asia. And make sure for the chapter you know all your concepts, ideas, and terms. It might be a longer list at the beginning of the chapter, but just a reminder that even if we don't cover it in lecture, there are a few other things that are in the book that you will need to cover on your own, or at least understand what they mean. They're highlighted in the text. Okay, so when we're looking at Asia, we've covered different parts of it. We covered Central Asia along with Russia, Southwest Asia along with North Africa. We more recently covered both East Asia and South Asia. So South Asia, the area of India, East Asia, the part around China. Now kind of sandwiched in between there and extending into the ocean is Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is what we're going to look at next. And just kind of looking ahead, we're also going to be covering two other realms. It sounds like a lot, but they're actually about half of a realm each, really. The rest of the ocean, including the Austral realm of Australia and New Zealand, pretty small one. And then the Pacific realm, which will extend out into the Pacific Ocean. And this will be kind of where we started in North America. We're kind of wrapping our way back around to the Pacific realm, kind of finishing our sweep of different realms of the world. Okay, so here's a figure of the Southeast Asian realm. And I'll show a different one that kind of highlights this a little better. But essentially between China and India, you have a set of countries, part of them on the peninsula and part of them on islands extending out into the ocean. This kind of shows it a little more clearly. We can divide this into two regions: the mainland region, the part that's connected, more physically connected to the Asian peninsula, and then part we can call the insular part. And the insular part is more of the islands that extend out into the ocean. The insular part is primarily three countries, a couple of other exceptions. The big countries here are Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, whereas on the mainland, we have Myanmar, also known as Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Beyond that, there's a few microstates, like very small countries, including the tiny state of Singapore, one of Brunei, and a fairly small country called East Timor. So those will come up as well. Right, this is from a different textbook, but I want to show include South and East Asia just to kind of give you a sense of the physical geography of this part of the world. One thing you might notice is that you have these kind of lowland river valleys and like the Ganges River Valley that we've discussed before in India, and you have these various other river valleys in China. And you have some of that too in Southeast Asia. You do have some lowland river valleys, but in between there, you have a lot of mountainous areas as well. And the same goes, you have a variety of different environments in the islands, and some of them are fragmented and broken up, and some of them are in bigger pieces. If we look at the type of vegetation, the natural vegetation of the region, this is another area of the world where we have tropical rainforests. So we have more mild climates like the United States and the East Asia, and a little bit more of a kind of drier tropical, monsoon climates in South Asia. But this part is like in the Amazon basin in Central Africa, another example of a place in the world with tropical rainforests. Now, many of those rainforests have been removed for agriculture, but under natural conditions, this is what we continue to have in many parts of Southeast Asia. So we have a tropical environment. The other thing we have is it can be a fairly mountainous environment. If we look at this figure of the Pacific Ring of Fire, if you recall that, We've talked before about how much of Central America and South America is on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So you have altitudinal zonation, mountainous areas like the Andes. And if you look across the ocean to the other side of the Pacific Ring of Fire, you can see that Southeast Asia has some similarities to places like Central America, that it has volcanoes, mountains, it has altitudinal zonation. Now, one exception here is that you can see the little dots from volcanoes, except here, this is an island called Borneo. The island of Borneo is actually not volcanically active. It's a very old, kind of like a mini continent that sits kind of in the middle of all of these volcanic islands in Southeast Asia. Okay, so one thing we do have in Southeast Asia, like we do in other parts of Asia, is important river valleys. And these are places that have, that are not as mountainous, typically, and have a lot of agriculture. So we talked about different river valleys in China, in India, in Pakistan. In Southeast Asia, there is one major river. It's the Mekong. It's called the Danube of Southeast Asia, or the Danube of Asia, perhaps. It starts up in China, it originates, and then it goes all the way down through many of the countries of Southeast Asia. In fact, it's the border for many of the countries. In Europe, there's a long river called the Danube, which forms the border of many European countries and extends a long ways through Europe. And so this is kind of similar to that. It's like the Danube in Europe, but it extends down through Southeast Asia. There's a few other ones that are not quite as big as the Mekong, like the Red River in Vietnam, the more northern Vietnam, the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, down through here, and another one, the Chao Phraya in Thailand. But the Mekong is the major river here. If we look at agriculture, one thing that we've talked about tropical environments, is how shifting cultivation is a common type of subsistence agriculture in these tropical environments. Because remember, in tropical environments, oftentimes the soil quality is poor, and so people have to resort to what we call slash and burn, or subsistence agriculture. Now, if we look at Southeast Asia, what we're going to do is look at two different islands here. We're going to look at Borneo, this big one. It doesn't have volcanoes, very stable, very old soils. And so shifting cultivation is the primary type of agriculture here. But in this island here, Jawa, also sometimes called Java, the agriculture is going to be different. They're going to have rice agriculture. And part of this is going to have to do with their physical geography. So Borneo, no volcanoes, has old soils that are not very productive. However, where you do have active volcanoes, the magma and ash over time actually bring up nutrients from within the earth and make the soils much more productive. Okay, so whether you have river valleys or volcanic soils, those places have very productive agriculture. You have what's called the wet rice cultivation. Wet rice cultivation is one that is not shifting cultivation. It stays in place because the soils continue to be productive. And you get these in two different situations. You either get them in river valleys or islands with volcanic soils. And these can sustain larger populations, whereas shifting cultivation, like on the island of Borneo, where you don't have river valleys, you don't have volcanic soils, you don't have very much population density. You can only support small populations as opposed to very dense populations. Okay, so we looked at Borneo with shifting cultivation, and the island of Java with more intense rice agriculture. And if we look at population density, we'll kind of zoom out and look at Asia as a whole. In South Asia, you have this, huge river valley where we have the massive amount of population for India with over 1 billion people. East Asia, massive river valleys, huge populations. Now, when we go here to Southeast Asia, you don't have those big blotches of red like you do in China or in India, but you do have smaller ones. For example, here in the Mekong River Delta, this is a very dense population. A lot of people live here, just not as much as you live in, say, China or India. So overall, the population density of Southeast Asia is not as big, the population density overall is not as much as in East Asia or China or in South Asia or India. But you do have it in certain places. You have it like in these river valleys here, like the Mekong. And if you look down here if you compare Borneo and Java, Borneo has very low population density because they use shifting cultivation, whereas Java, with its volcanic soils, has very high population density. So I'd like you to kind of, this is a good comparison. Know that Borneo and Java, how they're different from each other. Borneo has no volcanoes, so no volcanic soils, so poor soil quality and no rice, low population. Java, on the other hand, volcanic soils, very productive, and because you have so much food, you have a lot of population as well. Right? Also, the other takeaway is I want you to know that Southeast Asia overall is less densely populated than its neighbors of South Asia or East Asia. But it does have its little pockets that are densely populated. All right, so this is the population of countries in Southeast Asia. And the two big ones are Indonesia, and that's the real big one. It's a huge population of over 200 million people. And then the next largest country is the Philippines. And one thing I do want to point out, if you take the population of Indonesia and the Philippines, that accounts for over half of the population of Southeast Asia. So let me kind of go back a bit. Let me go forward. Okay, so this is the Philippines. This is Indonesia. They're part of the island part, the insular part. Those two countries account for over half of the population of Southeast Asia. After that, so 200 something million, Philippines has over 100 million, and then the rest kind of drop down from there. Now, one thing I will highlight while I have this up too is if you look at population density, if we look down this chart, one country that stands out is Singapore. Singapore is a tiny island country where everybody's packed on this little tiny island. So that's why you have such big population density, because it's just like one city. It's also relatively wealthy compared to other countries. If you look at the kind of like the average income, kind of, tens of thousands, and then you get over 100,000 here. It's kind of a wealthy little city-state in Southeast Asia. So that's Singapore. We're going to be talking about that later. Okay, but to finish up the discussion of population, if we rank countries of the world by their population, the most populated country is China. Not far behind it is India, and India is expected to surpass China sometime in the near future. Okay, the third largest country in the world is the United States. Right, so China, India, United States. Number 4, though, is in our region, Indonesia. So Indonesia, with over 260 million people, is the 4th largest country in the world after the US, China, and India. And lastly, if we look at the different countries, we've talked, if you recall in South America, we talked about how Chile was an elongated country. We even talked about how Uruguay was a compact country. Those are called territorial configurations. In Southeast Asia, gives us a few examples of this and other territorial configurations. So I'd like you to study this chart, understand examples, even examples that are not included on this page here. Cambodia is a good example of a compact state. You know, it's kind of a, you know, like a ball shape. An elongated country that's kind of long and thin, Vietnam is a good example of that. Thailand is a good example of a protruded state. And the Philippines are a good example of a fragmented state, meaning if you look at it, it's not all in one piece. It's a bunch of islands rather than one solid piece of land. So the Philippines are fragmented. And if you look here, Indonesia is also fragmented. It's broken up into a number of islands, many also small ones that are hard to see. And even Malaysia here, it's kind of half and half. Part of it's over here, part of it's over there. It's also a fragmented state. Now, one thing I'll point out over here that's kind of odd, if you look at Indonesia, it actually extends onto this island of New Guinea. And half of the island belongs to Indonesia, and the other half is an independent country called Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is actually going to be considered later in a different chapter because it's considered part of the Pacific realm rather than part of Southeast Asia. But it's kind of an odd thing where this island is divided half with Indonesia, half with the Pacific.